So you've probably been able to tell by now that I've been hitting on the idea of the importance of communication, clear communication, and transparency in organizational structures. And it's one of the biggest predictors of whether people are actually understanding what's going on in an organization or whether they're having to figure it out on their own. If you're allowing it to be figured out on their own, you're going to be prey to a lot of guessing, a lot of gossip, a lot of negativity. So, in general, as much as possible, organizations do benefit from clearer communication. But when we talk about clearer communication in an organization, again, we probably need to think about how do we actually set up the environments and the systems that allow this clear communication. And what is communication? What's communication within teams? What's communication between individuals? And what's communications on a organizational level? So understanding communication importance. So not only has communication always been an important part, but as we've moved from kind of theory X bureaucratic organizations to more theory Y people focused and human resources organizations, the need for that communication also has greatly increased. Additionally, technology has sped up the pace of work and transformed the way people do their jobs. 15 years ago, it would be unthinkable that I'd be recording a lecture right now, a few days after Thanksgiving in 2023, that'll then be listened to multiple times, maybe even over multiple years, as part of an online experience where students can choose when and how they listen to these lectures. So that's just one nature. Also, I currently am working in a fully virtual role. So again, this would have been unthinkable 10, 15 years ago, where almost all of my interactions with clients and with coworkers are done through virtual video conferences. And my work is being done on a central platform that allows everyone to come in and work together on the same projects. So work is more complex than ever before. Employees are likely to be distributed geographically, and knowledge and information are key to success. So whenever I do have a problem, it usually isn't a problem in my skills. It usually isn't a problem in the goals that I have. It's often knowing who should I be talking to and who has the information I need to be most successful. So the more an organization can do to make it clear what those communication lines are, who you should reach out to when you need to, and how to communicate, you're going to find an increase in productivity and an increase in satisfaction, less role ambiguity. So all of this stuff kind of interconnects. When we start talking about how we create positive organizations, it's not just about any one thing. It's not just about understanding stereotypes. It's not just about understanding attitudes. It's not just about understanding how we design the roles or how we design the organization. It's a cluster of these ideas, and all of them interrelate with each other. So, as always, let's start with a definition. Communication is the process by which a person, a group, or an organization, often referred to as the sender, transmits some type of information, the message. So that's the first thing, is that communication is a process involving a sender and a receiver and a message. The other person, group, or organization is the receiver, and the receiver receives the message. Now, that's the important part a lot of people don't understand about communication, is that for communication to truly work, I have to be sending information. The information has to go to a receiver, and the receiver has to understand and process the information. If the receiver isn't processing and understanding the information, communication has failed. So a lot of communication tends to be one way. A lot of communication is a sender has a message and sends it to the receiver, and that's where it ends. True communication is also a back and forth. It's one of the reasons I keep encouraging you that if you have any questions, reach out on Canvas on the Blackboard, or sorry, the Canvas discussion boards. Also reaching out via email, because what I'm doing in these audio lectures is I am the sender. I am transmitting the information, the lectures, and I'm transmitting it to you, the person that currently is receiving it and listening to it. How am I measuring whether you've received the message? Well, that's part of the purpose of the papers, the quizzes, and the discussions, is a way to gauge whether that message is being received. I'm also using multiple methods to send that message. So there's these audio lectures. If the sound of my voice really doesn't help you much, you can also just be looking at these lectures without the audio over them and just reading through them. And of course, there's also the chapter readings, and in some cases, there's also suggestions within the modules of other things and other resources to take a look at. Those are all methods of communication. All of them involve the sender, myself, and the potential teaching assistant, the platform that we're using, Canvas, and we're sending it to you, the receiver. What we need to determine, though, also is the receiver receiving messages. And ideally, that's from a back and forth. So I would be working with each one of you, or honestly, that's one of the advantages, at least in theory, of a live classroom, is that I can stop and ask, are there any questions? And we can have discussions at the moment. Now, in a virtual setting where we're asynchronous, in other words, when I'm recording these lectures, it's not necessarily the same time you're listening to these lectures. The way we do this is through more formalized discussion boards and more formalized quizzes as a way for me to gauge whether you're receiving that message. So some of the concepts that we want to think about when we're talking about communication includes encoding, the channels of communication, decoding, feedback, and noise. So all of these are parts of communication, and all of them are things that we can think about as, again, a model or levers to increase organizational communication. So encoding is the process by which an idea is transformed so that it can be transmitted to, recognized by the receiver. In other words, a written or spoken message, a video, a slogan. One of the things that we need to do in encoding to increase the likelihood of communication being successful is we want to make sure that we're encoding for the audience. So for example, if I was having a 30-year expert on astrophysics talk about string theory, and they were talking about it in the terms that only other people that had truly mastered, had a PhD in theoretical physics could understand, they would be encoding the ideas, but they would be encoding them to a very specific market. So that's one of the reasons why some of the scientists that we know are not necessarily the people that are breaking the boundaries with their research articles, but they're the ones that have figured out how to communicate these complex ideas that most of us can understand. That's a process of encoding. So whenever we're creating a message, we want to think a little bit about who is our audience. How do I want to write or talk to this audience? What words do I want to use? What jargon should I be using, if any? The next one is the channel of communication, the pathways over which the message will be transmitted. Again, telephone lines, mail, videos, live presentations. One of the things we know is the more channels you use, the more likely the message will be received, though you can actually kind of overindulge or basically inundate someone in the message. I often think about my own organization in this case. So almost all messages are communicated via email. And I will be honest, a lot of times when I get emails from the very highest up in my company, and my company is a Fortune 500, it is a large company, it's a global company, I tend not to read them very carefully. I might read the first couple of paragraphs or the first couple sentences, see if it really pertains to me, but I'm much less likely to attend to that. However, twice a year, we actually have a video chat where the leaders talk about the state of the company. That case, I usually do attend those and listen to them because, again, that's going to be a bigger overview of what's going on. So when we think about channels of communication, we also want to think what is appropriate for this message. Is this message something that we just want people to have access for them to search in their inbox, for instance, when they need it? Is it something that we definitely need to make sure that people are getting, and are we wanting to make sure that they're getting it in multiple ways? Decoding is the process by which a receiver of the message transforms them back into the sender's ideas. In other words, does the person actually get the message? Does the person understand the message? And part of this will be driven by encoding and channel of communication. But another thing we need to do is that fourth thing, feedback. Knowledge about the impact on the message of the receivers. Did they receive it and did they understand it? Finally, we've got noise, factors capable of distorting the clarity of message at any point during the communication process. So anything that might basically interrupt the encoding. So if the encoding is done very, very quickly and it really isn't well thought through, that would be noise. If the only way the communication is happening is through emails, and some of those emails are being automatically sent to spam filters, that would be noise. If when the people read it, some of them misread it or misunderstand some of the words, that would be noise. And if we ask people if they understand the message and they respond yes when they didn't, that again would be noise. So noise is basically any of the errors that can happen in this process. So the communication process, like I just said, noise is everywhere, but the sender needs to be thinking about what is the idea I want to send and how do I encode that idea. I then need to decide how I'm transmitting that encoded message through various media channels to the receiver. The receiver then hopefully receives the message and then decodes the message to where they understand it. And ideally, we want feedback. In other words, we want to be able to find out, did the person understand it? Quizzes are often a way that we find out the feedback to the sender. Did my lecture work? Are you understanding the various concepts? Within organizations, that feedback to sender might be meetings with your manager. That might be feedback sessions with coworkers. That might also just be a weekly pulse survey that is basically checking to see if people got the various messages that the organization sent that week. So why do we communicate? What is the purposes of communication? So there is an argument that all communication has purpose. In other words, all communication is an attempt to change people's opinions. It's basically to sway others. Even when we're just telling stories, we're telling the stories for a purpose. And that purpose is to communicate our experiences and potentially to make someone like us or fear us or understand our skill set better. So when we think about the purposes of communication, some people would argue that the purpose of all communication is to basically have influence on others. When we think about organizational communication, first, it's direct action. It's to achieve coordinated action systematically through sharing information. It's to share information, core of the organization's activities and values, to develop friendships, to fulfill social needs, to build trust and acceptance, and to explain organizational culture and generate ideas. Now notice that if we look at all of these could, by a cynical viewpoint, be considered efforts to influence. We're telling someone what to do, direct action. We're coordinating action and systematically sharing information towards a goal. We're trying to influence performance. We're sharing information, including the core of the organization's activities, so letting people know what's going on, what are the big goals, but also potentially communicating culture to make people more likely to follow that culture. To develop friendships. So again, when we communicate with people for social needs, we're also trying to highlight why we're good friends. To build trust and acceptance, and of course, examining organizational culture, explaining organizational culture, and generating ideas. So there are two main modes of communication, and that's what we're going to talk about next as we move forward. So there's verbal communication, the transmissions of messages using words, either written or spoken. Traditional verbal media, forms of communication that do not depend on the use of computers. So when we talk about verbal communication, we're talking about clear messages in written language. We want to think about how are the words being spoken, what is being spoken, and there is a difference. There's a difference between how we speak words. For instance, if I was simply wanting to communicate that you need to do better in class, I might say, hey, you really need to do better in class. Or I might say, hey, you really need to do better in class. Those are the exact same words, but how they're spoken is communicating a very different message. One hopefully communicated caring and a little bit of softness. The other one probably communicated an assertive demand. So again, when we think about verbal communication, we're not just thinking about what is written, what words are used, what level of education is necessary to understand the words that are used, but also who's speaking it and how it's spoken. For instance, there's been studies that have found that if you're talking about gender diversity, most audience members are more likely to respond to a male voice positive than a female voice. The male voice is basically recognized or is perceived, I should say, by most people as being less biased when it talks about various programs that advance women. When a woman says the same message in the same way, some people may interpret that as self-serving. So again, there's very small, subtle changes, but all of these need to be considered when we're communicating. A lot of times when we're talking about communication, we may also talk about traditional verbal media. So again, written word, newspapers, memos, or in-person communication, and communication via computers. In other words, emails, instant messages, chat rooms, and virtual video conferences. And there's a little bit of difference, again, when we think about those. Now, there's less difference than there used to be as more and more people are much more used to non-traditional verbal media. But you also want to make sure when you're looking into research, when you're thinking about how to craft verbal communication, take a look at when the study was done and ask the question, what kind of media were they actually examining? because a lot of those older studies, it will be basically spoken word in a conference or written words in memos that may not have the exact same impact or the same factors or concerns as the type of media that is currently used in most organizations today. So again, traditional forms of media include face-to-face discussions, telephone calls, memos and letters, newsletters, employee handbooks, flyers, and bulletins. And I should say that all of these are still used in most organizations. There's a lot of face-to-face. In fact, most companies that went for fully virtual are now pushing to at least get hybrid movement back to where people are in the office at some points. I still have telephone calls occasionally with people. And also, anytime you're using a video call and no one's on camera, that would effectively be a telephone communication, even though it's using computers. I still occasionally get PDF memos, and occasionally I even get mailed to me certain information from my company. And I will note that when I actually, because it's rarer, it tends to get my attention a little bit more. So when my company actually mails me a flyer, an employee handbook, I tend to spend a little more time than if they emailed me a PDF of the same. And this is also just recognizing that the uniqueness of the media chosen may also influence how the information is processed and attended to. So communication effectiveness. Communication is most effective when it uses multiple channels, such as both oral and written messages. Oral messages are useful in getting people's attention and allow for immediate two-way communication. Follow-up in writing makes the message more permanent. The medium's effectiveness depends on how appropriate it is for the type and kind of message being sent. Oral media is often more effective when the messages are ambiguous. Written media are more effective when messages are clear. So that's another lever we can think about. If I'm communicating something that's very easily understood and clear, let's say a policy change, and it's very clear how it functions, there's really no ambiguity to it, that's one that probably making sure everyone has access to a permanent written version makes a lot of sense. If what I'm wanting to communicate is the importance that an organization does a little bit better because we're looking at different ways, the organization is looking at different ways to potentially become more profitable, that might be a more ambiguous message. In other words, we haven't decided to start right-sizing or downsizing, but we are in a position of crisis and we need to think of solutions. That's not something that's going to be as well received or even understood as a written message. In fact, it might cause more panic than necessary compared to oral, a communication via maybe video, if we're talking non-traditional, or in person, where questions can be asked. So what do you mean crisis? What does that actually mean? Because in a written form, a lot of people are going to interpret those words in a lot of different ways. So this kind of gives us a continuum. So richness of communication media from lean to rich. So we start with very lean, basically just flyers and bulletins. We then go up to emails and letters, telephone, video conference, and face-to-face. So even there has been a decent amount of research in the last 3 years that has found that there is actually a little bit of a difference between face-to-face versus video conference. Technology has allowed us to make a lot of progress to allow two people to communicate over very long distances using video chat in a way that feels face-to-face. But we still behave differently to some degree in those video conferences than we do in a face-to-face meeting. For instance, at the end of a video conference, a lot of times people just start signing off. That wouldn't happen in a face-to-face meeting. People would actually hang around for a little bit and be social. I've also noticed at the end of a video conference, everyone tends to hold up their hand and wave at each other, as kind of like you'd do if you were leaving on a train. Again, this almost never happens in face-to-face meetings. So one of the things we can think about is how rich does the media need to be for the message we're sending? And what determines that is the clarity and complexity of the message. So the more routine and clear the message, the more it just needs to be gotten out there and people need to have access to it. Usually we can have a lean medium, flyers, emails, bulletins. If it's a non-routine, ambiguous message, the more likely we're needing to move towards telephone calls with managers, video conferences, or even large face-to-face meetings. So when we talk about computer-mediated communication, which you're probably very familiar with because this is a computer-mediated class, we basically have two broad types, synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous means real time. Video conferences, webcasts, cyber meetings, phone calls. Effectively, in some way or another, they're either group meetings, large meetings, or face-to-face meetings that are trying to simulate an in-person experience. So when someone talks, they're talking in real time. The person's listening in real time. People can ask questions in real time. So that is synchronous, and most organizations have tried to move to synchronous settings so that they're trying to basically get all the benefits of in-person communication in a synchronous video fashion with basically a hybrid or virtual workforce. Asynchronous also has values as basically the responses are at another time. So one of the things is email and instant messaging is often asynchronous. In other words, unless the person is immediately online and immediately responding, when you send an email or instant message, it may be responded to at another time. More specifically, asynchronous is also referring to any information, whether it's video, whether it's training, that is presented at your pace. In other words, the information is all available. If you desperately wanted to, when you started this course, you could have listened to all 15 modules on the very first day. It would have been fairly overwhelming, I would think, and hopefully you're following along with the weekly plan as suggested. But again, it's on your time. And also within each module, you have an entire week. You have a week to do whatever the assignments are, and you have a week to read the chapter, a week to listen to these lectures. And you can listen to them on your own time in your own way. And that's the big advantage of asynchronous, is I'm no longer having to be dependent on, are you available at the moment that I'm available to discuss this message? And in traditional classes, if I have my classes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m., what if you have an important meeting at 10 a.m. on one of those days? You're going to miss that lecture. However, in an asynchronous setting, you can listen to the lecture whenever you want to within a reasonable amount of time. So some of the things to think about is computer-mediated communication, privacy violations. It's very easy to monitor employees' messages and internet use. In fact, a lot of organizations, I actually don't know about my current organization, but my previous organization, if you read through the employee handbook, there was a little comment that every single email that you sent or received from company email was logged, was backdated, and was completely open for employee scrutiny. So if you have to start thinking about that. Additionally, my actual hours on the computer and the amount of time I spend working with clients is monitored in my current job. So the more that we're doing computer-mediated communication, it also provides the organization with a very easy way to track usefulness or track basically productivity. Similarly, because this class is on Canvas, I'm really not doing this, but one of the things I could do on Canvas is Canvas actually tracks how long you spend on Canvas. If you're actually listening to these lectures not on YouTube but through Canvas, it's logging that as well. And I can get access to that data if I really wanted to see what you were doing. I don't, because you're adults. This is your class. This is information that you're paying to receive. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as you're just being successful, that means you're probably learning the information. But these privacy violations can be concerning to some people, and we do want to think about, again, is this being communicated clearly? Do people understand this? And also, are they worried about security leaks? So user considerations include establish and follow a clear monitoring policy, let people know how it works, apply privacy policies equally across the company, and maintain complete company records on privacy. So again, that's one of the ways that we can kind of address this issue in organizations. So I want to end this module on nonverbal communication. So the current experience you're having with this module is verbal communication. It's written, I'm discussing it, I'm talking about it, and you can't see me. So you're not getting any nonverbal cues. When we have video calls, you get some nonverbal communication, but usually it's limited. Usually I'm not looking directly at you, I'm not making eye contact, I'm usually looking at something else on my computer screen. And even if I am trying to make eye contact with you, I'm probably looking somewhere other than where the camera is. I might be watching myself, for instance. So the information we get non-verbally, even from video chat, is a little different than the rich texture of information we get in in-person communication. If I'm sitting across from you in person, I'm getting everything. I'm getting your eye contact, I'm being able to watch your face, I can look at your posture, I can watch your hands, and all of that transmit messages. So basically, there's a lot of types of information. So when we're meeting with someone, the styles of dress communicate our appearance, the time, the waiting game. So do I have to wait to talk to you? Are you always late for meetings? Space, how close someone is sitting to you, how far they're sitting. Are they leaning in and listening to you? Or are they leaning back and somewhat ignoring you? Are their hands open and being used to express information? Or are their hands closed as they aren't kind of listening? And you can take a look at these faces. Just take a look at the people down. You can kind of look, that first person looks bored out of her gourd. The other person just looks disinterested. The third person looks like they're daydreaming. The fourth person might be considering what you're talking about, or they might be watching the ceiling fan. And the last person is clearly upset and not very happy to hear the information. That's the value of nonverbal communication. And it's one of the reasons why face-to-face meetings is our richest method of communication, because not only are we communicating verbally, not only can we get immediate feedback and questions, we also can communicate a lot, either positive or negative, with our nonverbal communication. So hopefully this helped you a little bit understand the ideas of communication, how it's used in organizations, and what we need to be looking at when we talk about communication for organizational effectiveness. We'll pick this back up in Module 2, and I'll talk to you whenever you have the chance to listen to that, as again, it is asynchronous.